Hello, I'm Mark Rosekind, a board member with the National Transportation Safety Board. This is Mr. Robert Aceta, who's the investigator in charge of this accident. We've been talking about 8 specific areas that the accident investigation has been focused on. Those 8 areas include railroad signals, railroad operations, railroad mechanical, recorders, vehicle factors, motor carrier operations, human performance, and survival factors. So I'm going to take you through the information that we have so far. I'm going to reiterate, we have been providing preliminary factual information. There will be further updates, and it's possible for some of this early factual information to change. So let's go through each of these 8 areas, starting with the rail signals. Now all of the signaling system has been tested. So that means the grade crossing warning system, lights, bells, gates, as well as the traffic lights. We've been making the point that it's not just whether things were flashing, etc., but also the timing and synchronization. That has all been tested, and as of this point, there are no anomalies that have been found, and the system is functioning as designed. Now, we've also talked about this area being identified as a quiet zone, which basically means typically there would be a horn blast a quarter mile before the grade crossing. In a quiet zone, there's no horn blast. The city of Midland was the applicant to designate this as a quiet zone. There's a specific process that's gone through where basically there have to be alternative safety measures provided in lieu of that horn blast. So there's a formal process, and our investigators will now be looking to see exactly what those safety measures were and whether they were in place at the time of the accident. Another piece of information that's emerged is that this crew came on at Pecos, Texas. And then 9 miles outside of Pecos, there was an absolute stop signal test. This is called an efficiency test. Essentially, a signal goes to the engine that says stop. And this crew stopped. A Union Pacific manager comes on board, says that everything went fine, interacts with the crew, and then released them. What's important about this is they were allowed to proceed, and there were no issues identified. Regarding number 3, rail mechanical. There's ongoing information that's being collected. Yesterday, we reported that at this point, there's no mechanical, maintenance, or track anomalies that have been identified. And I want to emphasize that when we say no anomalies have been identified, it doesn't mean that that's been ruled out. Just at this point, we haven't identified anything. Our highway group, in collaboration with our rail group, is planning a sight distance test. This is where a similar locomotive engine, along with a truck, are going to be at the intersection where the collision occurred. And our investigators from highway, rail, and others basically will be spending over 3 hours taking all kinds of measurements, photographs, and other kinds of factual information obtained. That was planned for Monday. Basically, there's been a lot of elements that they have to put together, and so that is now going to be scheduled for Tuesday. And I'm telling you that because Tuesday morning, there will be a tweet from the NTSB to tell you what time, and there's also been a request for a specific observation area for media. And so Tuesday morning, you'll hear what time, and if that observation area has been identified, then we'll be able to let you know that as well. But that is important to know. There's a switch from Monday to Tuesday for that. Number 4 is recorders. Tomorrow on Monday, the recorders group, which includes the NTSB investigators and the parties to the investigation, will be convening in Washington, D.C. at the NTSB Recorders Lab. This group basically will be reviewing all the information from the recorders, both the video and event recorders that we've been discussing. They'll be spending at least 2 days probably going over all of this information, and their job is to make further refinement of the information. Basically, there will be group agreement about the factual information. So this is where I have to highlight again, we've been giving you preliminary factual information. There will clearly be updates, like from this kind of group meeting, and it's possible that there could be changes as well. Vehicle factors. Our investigators have been gathering the model, serial number, post-crash measurements of the trailer, as well as taking tire measurements and other kinds of information. There's a functional test that has to be done on the tractor trailer. That can't be done until a little bit later. We're actually, if you recall, we're having somebody from headquarters come to get the engine control module and see if there's any information on that. We don't expect, but we won't be able to do the functional test until that information is downloaded. Now, number 6, in the motor carrier operations area, This truck was owned by Smith Industries Incorporated, local to Midland. They've been cooperative. They, in fact, are now trying to identify a truck to participate in the site distance test that's on Tuesday. Our investigators are going to be meeting with them tomorrow on Monday, and they have already offered to help facilitate an interview with the truck driver. So that's in progress. Yesterday, I mentioned that our investigators had an opportunity to meet and interview the organizers of this event. And one of the things we did learn is that the current route that was in this event has been in place for 3 years. Another thing we've been emphasizing is that it is critical for us to know what the permits, requirements, processes are to hold a procession, parade, event, etc. So our investigators were able to obtain today the city requirements for a procession and parade. With that information now, they will be able to go forward and determine whether or not those requirements were actually met. Human performance. Our human performance investigator has been joining the motor carrier operations folks. And as I mentioned yesterday, the interviews with the train engineer and conductor were finished yesterday, fully cooperative, and our human performance investigator reports that both the engineer and conductor have provided a lot of information about their 72-hour work-rest history. So that's literally things like when they went to bed, when they ate, etc. Provided cell phone numbers, which will allow our investigators to pursue information about any conversations on the phone or texting. And our human performance investigator reported that both of these folks have clear memories of the event. I have nothing to report specifically about what was in there, but they have a clear memory of the events that took place. Number 8 is survival factors. Our investigator has been documenting the seating at the time of the crash. And so we now know all 12 males were on the left side, 12 females on the right side. Think of the left side as column A, the right side as column B. And the heroes that lost their lives in this accident were seated in 4A, 5A, 6A, and 7A. So they're in sequence, all on the left side. Fire and EMS were on scene minutes after the collision, and emergency management was at the fairgrounds waiting for these folks to arrive, and they actually heard of the collision in real time and responded. So let me close by, with just a few things. One is this is our last on-scene update, and I want to be clear, this is the last on-scene update for you folks, but our investigators are remaining on scene, further collecting more factual information. They expect to still be here for another 4 to 7 days at least. Within 10 business days after they leave, a preliminary report will be published on the NTSB website that basically will be the latest factual summary of the information that's available. There will be no determination of probable cause in that preliminary report, no analysis of the factual information, but it will have the latest. All of these briefings are available in video on the NTSB website. And if you have ongoing media questions, it would be best to contact Public Affairs at the NTSB, which is 202-314-6100. 202-314-6100. And you can also follow us on ntsb.gov. I think the website has a lot of information there for you about our processes, specifics about this investigation, and follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/NTSB. I also want to just reiterate that if our investigators were to identify a safety issue that needs to be addressed immediately, then we would issue an urgent safety recommendation. We don't have to wait to the end or completion of our investigation to issue an urgent safety recommendation if it's going to meet some need to address a safety issue that's identified now. So that could happen at any time if we were to find something. So we have some time for questions.
What can you tell us about the driving background of the driver of the truck? I heard that he was a volunteer, a retired lieutenant colonel. Can you confirm that? And did he have any professional driving experience?
So the question is, what can we talk about regarding the driver, background, history, qualifications? Why that's important now is tomorrow is when we're going to be getting, hopefully, an interview set up with the driver. And so there's at least two parts of that. One is collecting the background information, which our folks are doing now, and some of that's collected from the driver. So we're still in the process of collecting that information.
Do you have anything at this point that you know if he was a professional driver, what kind of training he had at all?
The question is whether we have any information about him, and we're still in the process of gathering that.
Do you know
if he worked for Smith Industries?
The question is, do we know if he worked for Smith Industries? And we're still determining that too. These are good questions. As you know, this is almost entirely all volunteer organization and activity. So there are a lot of things that have been donated, and that's part of what we're trying to figure out is which part is volunteer, which part was paid for, because that changes kind of the rules, if you will, of what has to be followed.
I had a quick question once again about the seating of the men and women, because in my mind I'm picturing the right side was the side struck by the train, but the men were on the left. Any idea why they were the ones that ended up dying? Because if the impact happened on the right side?
That's backwards.
Or did I hear you wrong?
The men were on the left. So the question is sort of where the seating were. The information we had is that the men were on the left, the men on the right, and I'm sorry, yes, the men on the left, women on the right, and yes, that seems opposite of sort of what we've understood, and I'll have to check that with you, and we'll do that through photographic and other kinds of information to do that.
What was the warning time that this system was designed to provide by the state of Texas?
The question is the amount of warning time required by the state of Texas,
Correct.
and you're talking about the train approaching the grade crossing?
The signal system, right?
So there's a 20-second, and that's a federal minimum requirement for the lights, bells, and gates to be starting within 20 seconds of when the train arrives. So there's actually a sensor 20 seconds out.
I know how it works. I know the federal minimum is 20, but I know that same regulation requires the design time to be the time that's provided. And I want to know if you're aware that the design time here was actually 30 seconds.
So the question is, and we talked about this before, there's basically a federal minimum. There can be other design requirements of a particular crossing, and so this one may have different sort of requirements for this one. We're still looking into that and trying to collect. And you're pointing out they're both federal as well as state, sometimes even local changes related to a grade crossing, and our investigators are looking into all those.
Sir, it's my understanding that the state of Texas uses federal funds to pay for these. The state of Texas has the ability to require more than 20. It's also my understanding that the Union Pacific has a standard of 30 seconds. And I'm just curious if you guys are trying to check into that design time and not just the absolute minimum.
Right. And so the question really is there are some federal minimums. The state can have other requirements. The Union Pacific, the company itself can do other things. And yes, we'll be looking to every single one of those for not only what was in place, but was it followed or not. And this raises again that even though we say everything was functioning, we have to make sure it's in line with what the requirements were for this particular crossing.
Do you have the names of the conductor, engineer, or truck driver that you can release yet?
We don't release that information. So the question is whether we have information about the engineer, conductor, the truck driver, et cetera, and we're in the process of interviewing those people, collecting that, but we don't release that personal information. Yes?
You said that the parade or the procession had followed the same route for 3 years. Have you looked into, or do you have any information whether they submitted permits to the city or to any authority? Did they let Union Pacific know that the parade was going to be happening at that time? The other thing I wanted to ask you is yesterday I asked you about when they raised the...
Can we do one at a time? Do the first one? Is that all right? So the first question basically has to do with the permit process and whether it was followed or not. And I think you asked that question previously, and at that time my only answer really could be we have to figure out what the requirements, permits were, et cetera. So what's good about what I can tell you today is we have identified the city ordinance that deals specifically with processions and parades. In fact, excluded are military parades, funeral processions, and there's specific permits and things that are required 30 days out, multiple departments. Now that we know what's required, we can actually go after that information. And I remind you, it's a weekend, which is why we've been unable basically to access some of the records at this point. What's helpful is we now know what to ask for and what to go look for.
Can you say what the
Can I-
ordinance requires?
So can I come back?
Sorry.
Let me just, the question is sort of what it requires, and what I can tell you is there are sections that basically have 30 days notice, and multiple departments are involved.
Does that include Union Pacific?
And I have to look at that to see, the question is whether it includes the company or not, and we have to see. And that's why, again, this is the city ordinance that we have now for the permit. So we have to actually see what was required, whether it was followed or not, and who actually performed those actions, and whether they were correct or not. Back to your second question.
The second question is, when they raised the speed limit, yesterday I asked about whether there were changes made to the system, to the warning system, to allow for that speed change and to, I guess, lengthen the time that the signals would, that the signals would be activated.
So the question is, basically, were there adjustments to the signal system, like timing of the warning ahead of the grade crossing when the speed change occurred? We're looking into that. So we know about that speed change, and as I mentioned, we're looking back. I've already given you some information on the 1979 to 1997 number of accidents that happened here, et cetera. We're looking into all of that. That will include things like the speed change, and see if we can identify whether there were any changes there, not just in the speed, but as you're pointing out, the grade crossing system, et cetera, that could have played a role in this accident. We're looking into that. And again, I think that's a way to highlight, right now we're after the perishable information, the stuff that's here. A lot of things you're asking about are records that we're going to be going after once we know what we need to be looking for.
Is there any new information about the truck's actions after the warning system came on and what the truck did or didn't do? Is there any new information on that?
So the question, if there's any new information basically from yesterday's 21-second description of what's going on. At this point, there isn't. But this is moving pretty quickly because basically I've just said that tomorrow in Washington, a group is getting together to do a refined review of all of that recorder information that's going to take a couple days. There could be new information that comes out more specifically after that.
What kind of event recorders were in that crossing?
The question is, what kind of event recorders were in that crossing? Specifically,
Common crossing analyzer, PMD.
okay, so the question is, what kind of event recorder? And I'll tell you what, Mr. Aceta, is there anything you'd like to specifically? No.
Right
Yeah.
now, I don't know the specific brand or type of equipment.
And I asked because I think that was going to be the answer, which is, I already mentioned in the truck, we're getting models and serial numbers. We will have all of that for the signal system. Our investigators may already have that. I just don't have that kind of information in front of me. And frankly, those kind of detailed things, we're happy if you call Public Affairs and we've got it, we'll make that available to you. You should all know that one of the things that will appear on ntsb.gov is a public docket on this investigation. And so as factual reports from each of the 8 groups I talked about actually become agreed upon, they will be published on the website in a public docket that you can access.
What can you say about the official escort?
So the question is, what about the official escort? And that's something we still need to look into, because now that we understand the permit process and basically what was supposed to be followed, now we need to go and see if that was actually followed at the time for this event.
You mentioned earlier that the signals were working, but if they were working properly is still the question. Was there any merit to the, I guess, the belief that there may have been a power outage at one time around the area? Did that prove to be true?
So let me just take 2 questions there. One is, and thank you for listening, because you're right. One of the things we've been reporting is, we don't find something at an anomaly, and it might have been working. That doesn't mean it was working properly. The grade crossing warning system was tested today. So new information for today: lights, bells, gates, traffic lights, timing, synchronization, no anomalies, and it was functioning as designed at the time of the accident. Okay? And
that you interviewed the shuttle support organizers. What efforts did they make, if any, to notify the railroad or get information about the train schedule, or did they pretty much just leave that to other authorities because they figured we have the permit, so it's going to be taken care of?
so the question is, what actions the event organizers took regarding permits and structures, let alone what the other volunteers. Communication with the railroad, well, and the other authorities as well. And I'm raising that because we're looking into that right now. Again, we now know what the permit requirements were and what actions had to be taken. And part of what we're going to have to look for right now is who is responsible for taking that action and whether it was done or not.
You interviewed them yesterday. What did they tell you? What did they do?
And it was interviewed yesterday. We have not reported anything except the basics of, yes, this is the same route for 3 years. And so all of that I actually have not really been able to give you much specifics of the interviews at all. I'm giving you more general information. The engineer and conductor have clear memories, et cetera. We're not reporting on the content of that. So again, these folks who are obviously very concerned about what happened are needing now to allow our investigators to go and find any records about what actions we're taking. which, by the way, is another piece. We'll do interviews, but after the interviews, we actually have to go and get the records of what was done. One of the questions that basically is raised by that is not just this event, but over the last 9 years. So one of the things we did learn, this is just factual information, is there was a sergeant who was in charge of this that retired a few years ago. So now there's a new person who's doing it. So we have to follow all of that information, not just through interviews, but through the documentation to see what was done, not just in the past, but for this particular event.
One more question.
So last question.
Through following this route for the past 3 years, do you have proof that in previous years those permits were filed? I know the guy just retired, but was it like in the past 3 years or before those past 3 years? So we'll know.
And so the question is not just this event, but in the past, were the permit and other kinds of requirements, procedures followed? We don't know that yet, but that's part of what we need to look at. And you're raising a good issue, which is, was this event sort of particular to this year, or were there issues that have been ongoing for a period of time, just we didn't know about them? Nobody knew about them in the organizers or with the event. That's the kind of thing. We won't just be looking at this event, but whether it's the grade crossing or something else, we'll be going back for as long as we can, basically, to find out if that history is relevant to this investigation. I encourage you really to follow the NTSB. There'll be much more information coming out. We are leaving the scene. Investigators are here 4 to 7 days. That's the 202-314-6100. That's public affairs at the NTSB. Thanks very much.